The toast had been the same for 4 years. Every anniversary, every holiday where Theo happened to be at our table, somebody would raise a glass and Sophie would say it again, light and easy, like a line from a play she'd performed so many times she no longer heard the words. He's practically my brother. My name is Caleb Andrade, and for most of my marriage, I believed that sentence the way I believed gravity, not because I tested it, but because nothing had ever given me a reason to doubt it. I was 34 years old, an architect at a mid-sized firm in Richmond, Virginia, and on the night this story really starts, I was standing in my own kitchen holding my wife's phone, which had buzzed twice on the counter while she showered upstairs. I want to say I wasn't the kind of man who checked. For 7 years with Sophie, 3 dating, 4 married, I never had. That wasn't restraint. It was something closer to certainty, a structural assumption I'd poured into the foundation of the relationship and never once gone back to inspect. The message preview read, Theo, can't stop thinking about the lake house. We should have told him years ago. I read it 3 times before the words rearranged themselves into something I could actually metabolize. The lake house. Years ago. We should have told him. Sophie's voice came from the bathroom, asking if I'd grabbed towels from the dryer. I said yes, though I hadn't, and I set the phone back down exactly where it had been, screen dimming to black, and I stood in my kitchen feeling like a man who had just watched a crack open across a foundation he'd spent 7 years assuming was solid concrete all the way down. We met Theo the same month I met Sophie, junior year of college, a mutual friend's apartment, a party with cheap beer, and someone's broken stereo. Theo had been Sophie's closest friend since their freshman dorm days, the kind of friendship that survived breakups and bad semesters and cross-country moves, the kind I'd never questioned because questioning it would have meant questioning the entire architecture of trust I'd built my marriage on. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside Sophie, listening to her breathing settle into the rhythm I'd memorized over years, and I thought about the lake house, her parents' place on Smith Mountain Lake, where we'd spent a long weekend the summer before our engagement, where Theo had also been present for part of that trip, crashing 2 nights on the pull-out couch because his own place had a plumbing emergency. We should have told him years ago. Told me what? I want to explain what our marriage looked like from the inside, because the story that follows will sound, to anyone hearing only the ending, like a man who was willfully blind. I don't think that's quite right. I think I was a man who had decided, early and permanently, that trust was a single transaction rather than an ongoing practice, something you established once, through years of evidence, and then filed away as settled. Sophie worked as a hospital administrator, the kind of job that ate evenings and weekends in unpredictable bursts, budget crises, and staffing emergencies that pulled her into late calls I never thought to question. We lived in a renovated bungalow in the Fan District, the kind of house I designed half my career to eventually afford, with a porch swing Sophie's mother had given us as a wedding gift and a garden Sophie tended with more patience than she showed for almost anything else in her life. Theo had been a fixture in that life since before I arrived in it. He'd been best man at our wedding, not my choice, but Sophie's insistence, since my actual closest friend had moved to Seattle years earlier and Sophie argued, not unreasonably, that someone who'd known us both that long deserved the role more than a groomsman flown in for the weekend. I'd agreed without much resistance. Theo was easy to like, quick with a joke, generous with rounds at the bar, the kind of friend who remembered your coffee order and your father's name. He'd dated on and off over the years, nothing serious, nothing that lasted past a few months, and Sophie always had a theory about why each one hadn't worked, delivered with the slightly proprietary affection of someone who considered herself an authority on a brother's love life. I never thought to wonder why a woman would maintain that level of involvement in a platonic friend's romantic failures for over a decade. I filed it, like everything else about Theo, under the heading of That's Just Sophie and Theo, a category that required no further inspection because I decided, somewhere in the early years, that inspection wasn't necessary. The morning after I saw the text, I watched Sophie move through our kitchen with her usual economy of motion. Coffee, toast, the particular way she checked her phone 3 times during breakfast without ever seeming distracted by it. I studied her in a way I hadn't studied her in years, looking for something I couldn't name, and found nothing except the woman I'd married, doing the things she always did. "You're quiet this morning," she said, not looking up from her phone. "Didn't sleep great." Poor thing. She kissed the top of my head on her way to the sink, An automatic gesture, affectionate and unthinking, the kind of touch that had always felt like proof of something solid between us. That morning it felt like a performance I was watching from slightly outside myself, unable to tell anymore which parts were genuine and which parts I'd simply never thought to question. I didn't say anything about the text. I told myself I needed more context before I raised it. A reasonable-sounding justification that, in hindsight, was just my conflict avoidance wearing the costume of patience. I had spent years building an identity around being the unjealous husband, the one who didn't need to monitor his wife's friendships, who trusted by default and considered that trust a virtue rather than a habit I'd never tested. Pulling that thread felt like pulling at my own sense of who I was, not just at the question of what Sophie had or hadn't done. That weekend, Theo came over for dinner, as he did most months, bringing a bottle of wine and his usual easy charm. I watched him in a way I'd never watched him before. The way he and Sophie fell into private shorthand within minutes, finishing each other's sentences about people I half knew. The way his hand rested briefly on her shoulder when he made her laugh, a touch so casual it would have meant nothing to me a week earlier. Now I cataloged it. Now everything was evidence, and I hated that I'd become a man who needed evidence at all. "You're staring," Sophie said later, after Theo left, as we cleared the table. "Just tired," I said. The lie came easily, the way lies do once you've started telling them. I spent the next several weeks in a state I can only describe as low-grade vigilance. Not quite suspicion, not quite trust, some uncomfortable third state where I noticed everything and concluded nothing. Sophie's behavior, examined under this new and unwelcome scrutiny, didn't change. That was, in its own way, the most disorienting part. If she was hiding something, she was hiding it inside a routine so consistent it offered no seams to pull at. I started thinking, obsessively, about the lake house trip, the long weekend the summer before our engagement, 6 years ago now, when Theo had crashed on the pull-out couch for 2 nights because of a plumbing emergency at his apartment. I remembered very little about those 2 nights specifically. I remembered drinking beer on the dock with Theo while Sophie's parents grilled burgers. I remembered falling asleep early one night, exhausted from a week of work, while Sophie and Theo stayed up talking on the porch, their voices and laughter drifting faintly through the screen door as I drifted off. I had never once, in 6 years, thought twice about that detail. Now it sat in my chest like a stone. I called my old college roommate, Marcus, who'd been at that lake house weekend too, ostensibly to catch up, but really to see if he remembered anything from that trip that might mean something now. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing before I worked up the nerve to ask, "Hey, random question. You remember that weekend at Sophie's parents' lake house, before we got engaged? Theo crashed there a couple nights." "Vaguely," Marcus said. "Why?" "Just thinking about it. Nostalgic, I guess." I hated how transparent my own deflection sounded, even to myself. "I remember you fell asleep early both nights," Marcus said, with the easy carelessness of someone recounting an unremarkable memory. "And I remember thinking it was kind of funny that Sophie and Theo stayed up so late both times. Like, hours after everyone else crashed. But that's just them, right? They've always been close. That's just them." The same phrase I'd used myself for years, a phrase that had functioned as a permanent closed door over a room I'd never thought to open. I didn't sleep well again that night. I lay there constructing and dismantling timelines, trying to remember exact dates, trying to recall if there had been any change in Sophie's behavior in the months following that trip, anything that might confirm or deny the shape forming in my mind. I remembered, vaguely, that Sophie had seemed unusually quiet for a week or 2 after we got back from the lake, something I'd attributed at the time to work stress. I remembered Theo being slightly more distant for a stretch that same fall, something Sophie had explained as him processing a recent breakup. Every memory I excavated now seemed to wear 2 possible meanings, and I had no reliable way to know which one was true. I started, almost against my own will, doing something I'd never imagined myself capable of, paying closer attention to Sophie's phone habits, her calendar, the small administrative residue of a life I'd never thought required monitoring. I noticed she and Theo texted nearly every day, nothing I could see directly, since her phone was passcode locked and I refused, even now, to actually break into it, some last vestige of the man I'd been holding the line against the man I was becoming. But I saw the notification previews when they came in during dinner, during movie nights, during ordinary moments that had never struck me as suspicious before because I'd never been looking. Most were innocuous. Did you see what happened with the Hendrix deal? Lunch Thursday. Ugh, my mom again. Ordinary friendship debris, the kind any two close friends might exchange. But every so often, something landed slightly off. An emoji that felt too intimate. I miss you that seemed disproportionate for two people who saw each other regularly. A vague reference to something I had no context for. The unfinished sentence from that first night, "We should have told him years ago," sat unresolved in my mind like an exposed wire. I needed to know what it meant. I needed to know it more than I'd ever needed to know anything. And the not knowing had started to feel like its own kind of injury, separate from whatever the actual answer might be. I am, by training, a man who builds things meant to last, structures engineered to withstand load, weather, time. I had never applied that same scrutiny to my marriage, because I had decided early on that scrutiny itself was a betrayal of trust, that asking questions was its own kind of disloyalty. I understand now how convenient that belief was. It let me avoid the discomfort of ever finding out something I didn't want to know. The break came almost by accident, the way these things often do. Sophie left her laptop open on the kitchen table one evening while she ran upstairs to take a work call, and a notification slid across the top of the screen. An email preview from an address I didn't recognize, subject line blurred by the brevity of the preview, but containing, unmistakably, Theo's first name and the word anniversary. I didn't open her laptop. I want to be clear about that, the same way I'd refused to break into her phone. But I looked at the preview long enough to register the sender's name. An email address that wasn't his usual one, something with numbers in it, the kind of secondary account people create when they want a layer of separation between an ordinary life and something else. That night, I asked Sophie directly, for the first time, the question I'd been circling for weeks. Does Theo have a second email address? She looked up from the dishes, and something crossed her face too quickly for me to fully read. Not panic exactly, but a recalibration. The look of someone whose footing has just shifted slightly beneath them. I don't know. Why would you ask that? I saw a notification on your laptop. From some account I didn't recognize. It mentioned an anniversary. It's probably about his parents, she said, too quickly, the explanation arriving before the question had fully finished. They're celebrating their 40th this year. I think he's helping plan something. It was plausible. It was even, possibly, true. But I had spent enough weeks now cataloging every gesture, every too quick answer, every explanation delivered with slightly more speed than the moment required, that I no longer trusted my own ability to separate genuine reassurance from rehearsed deflection. I started, with a reluctance that felt like betraying my own values, building an actual case. I went back through old photos on our shared cloud storage, years of them, birthdays and holidays and ordinary weekends, looking at Sophie and Theo with the eyes of a man searching for evidence rather than the eyes of a husband simply remembering his life. I found things I'd never noticed before, not because they'd been hidden, but because I had never looked. A photo from 4 years ago, the week before our engagement, where Theo's hand rested at the small of Sophie's back in a way that read entirely differently now than it had when I first saw it. A series of texts, visible only because Sophie had once shown me her phone screen in passing years earlier, then quickly closed the app. At the time I'd thought nothing of it. Now the memory rearranged itself into something with weight. I found an old voicemail, accidentally saved on a shared family computer from years before. Theo's voice leaving a message for Sophie that I'd half heard once and immediately forgotten. Something about needing to talk before this goes any further. A message I'd assumed, at the time, referred to some unrelated drama, perhaps about a job or an apartment. Now it sat differently in my memory, reframed by everything I'd learned since. I confided, finally, in my sister, Naomi, the only person I trusted enough to say any of this out loud to. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Caleb," she said carefully, "I need you to ask yourself something. Do you actually want to know the answer? Or do you want someone to tell you you're imagining all of this?" I didn't have an answer for her. I think, looking back, I wanted both things simultaneously, in roughly equal measure, which is its own kind of paralysis. I decided, finally, to talk to Theo directly, not Sophie. I told myself this was strategic, that he might be less prepared for a direct question than she would be. But the truth was simpler and less flattering. Some part of me still trusted Theo enough, after a decade of friendship, to believe he might tell me the truth where Sophie wouldn't. We met for a drink at a bar near his office, ostensibly just catching up. I let the conversation run its ordinary course for 20 minutes. His work, my work, a recent Richmond restaurant opening neither of us had tried yet. Before I asked the question plainly, watching his face as I did. Did something happen between you and Sophie? Before we got engaged. Theo's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not the wide-eyed denial I half expected, not the easy deflection I'd seen so many times from Sophie over the past weeks. He went very still, his glass halfway to his mouth, and set it down without drinking. And in that stillness I understood, with total certainty, that the answer was yes, before he ever said a single word. "Caleb," he started. "Just tell me." He looked at me for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of someone finally being asked the question they've been waiting years to answer. "It was a long time ago," he said quietly, "before you two were even engaged. It was a mistake. It happened once, and it never happened again. And I have spent the last 6 years telling myself it didn't matter because it was before you two were really, officially together forever, before the ring, before any of it." "Define a long time ago." "The lake house," he said, and I felt the floor I'd been bracing for finally, fully give way. "The summer before you proposed." I drove home that night without remembering a single mile of the route, the kind of dissociated driving you do when your body completes a task your mind has fully abandoned. Sophie was in the living room reading when I came in, and she looked up with an ordinary smile that died the moment she saw my face. "What happened?" I talked to Theo. I watched the color drain from her face in real time, watched her body go through a series of small physical adjustments. The book closing slowly, her spine straightening, her hands folding together in her lap in a posture that looked almost like prayer. "Caleb." He told me about the lake house. She didn't move for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I was going to tell you eventually. I just never found the right time, and then the longer I waited, the more impossible it felt to start. When I said, I need an exact date. I need to know exactly when this happened. Does the exact date actually matter that much to you?" "Yes." My voice had gone flat, strangely calm. The calm of someone whose internal systems had simply stopped registering the full weight of what was happening, processing it instead in small, manageable fragments. "It matters. Tell me when." "The second night. While you were asleep." She said it without elaboration, as if elaboration would only make it worse, though I'm not sure anything could have made it worse than the bare fact itself. "Why?" "Caleb, I don't think there's an answer to why that's going to satisfy you right now. Try." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, something in her had shifted, not toward the calculated deflection I might have expected, but toward something rawer, something that sounded less rehearsed than anything she'd said to me in weeks. "I was scared," she said. "We'd been together 3 years. I knew you were going to propose soon. I think I even knew it was that exact trip. Somehow, some instinct told me. And I panicked. Not about you. About forever. About whether I was actually ready for what forever meant, or whether I was just moving forward because it was the expected next step and I didn't know how to stop the momentum." "So you slept with Theo?" "I know how it sounds. It sounds exactly like what it is." My voice still hadn't risen. I noticed this distantly, as if observing myself from outside my own body. The absence of shouting, the strange stillness settling over me instead, a kind of internal shutdown I didn't recognize and couldn't seem to override. I asked her again, the same question reframed. "Why him? Of everyone. Why your closest friend, 2 nights before I was about to propose?" "Because he was safe," she said, and something in her voice cracked slightly. "Because nothing about it threatened to become something real. I think some part of me needed to do something reckless before I committed to something permanent, and Theo was the person I trusted enough to be reckless with, because I never believed it would actually go anywhere." I asked the question a third time, differently worded, because no answer she gave seemed to land anywhere I could actually process it. "Why didn't you tell me before the wedding? You had 3 years." "Because I was a coward," she said. "Because every year that passed made it feel like a smaller, more containable secret, until eventually it felt like telling you would do more damage than carrying it ever had. I told myself I was protecting you. I think really I was protecting myself. I stood up. I didn't decide to stand up. My body simply did it. Some autonomic response disconnected from any conscious choice. I need to not be here right now, I said. Caleb, please. I was already walking toward the door. She said my name once more, and I heard the word wait trailing behind me. Unfinished, and I kept walking, out into a night that felt entirely unfamiliar despite being the same street I'd walked 1,000 times before. I drove to Naomi's apartment and sat in her kitchen until 2 in the morning, saying very little, accepting the tea she made without really drinking it. She didn't push me to talk. She simply sat with me, occasionally refilling my untouched cup, and somewhere around 1 in the morning, I finally said the thing that had been circling beneath everything else. 7 years, I said. I thought I knew exactly what our relationship was for 7 years. Now I don't know which parts were real. The marriage was real, Naomi said carefully. What happened before it doesn't erase 4 years of an actual marriage, Caleb. It complicates it. It doesn't erase it. I wasn't sure, that night, whether I believed her. I stayed at Naomi's for 5 days. Sophie texted twice a day, never pushing, never demanding a response, just brief messages that said, in essence, I'm here when you're ready. Take whatever time you need. I didn't respond to most of them. I spent those 5 days doing something I'd never properly done in 7 years with Sophie, actually examining, piece by piece, what our relationship had been built on and what it might be built on going forward, if anything. The hardest part wasn't the act itself, strange as that might sound. Plenty of relationships survive a single transgression that occurred before a formal commitment was made. What sat heaviest in my chest was the 6 years of silence that followed. The toasts at anniversaries where Sophie called Theo practically my brother, delivered with an ease that now read, in hindsight, as a carefully maintained performance rather than simple affection. Every dinner where the three of us sat together, where I'd watched their easy friendship and felt nothing but warmth, had actually been built on top of a secret the two of them had carried together, a shared history I had been excluded from by design, not by accident. I thought about Theo's voicemail from years earlier. We need to talk before this goes any further, and understood now that it likely referred to the engagement itself, some private negotiation between the two of them about whether the secret could survive a wedding, a marriage, a lifetime. I thought about Marcus's casual memory of Sophie and Theo staying up late on the porch while I slept, oblivious, in the next room, and felt a fresh wave of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, some third feeling I didn't have a name for yet. I called Theo once during those 5 days, not to yell at him, though I'd expected I might. Instead, I asked him a single question that had been gnawing at me since our conversation at the bar. Did you ever think about telling me yourself? At any point in 6 years. Every year, he said quietly. Every single anniversary toast, I thought about it. I told myself it wasn't my secret to tell, that it was hers to decide. I think that was just a convenient way of not having to be the one who broke everything. You let me build a friendship with you knowing this the whole time. I know, he said, and for the first time, his voice carried something that sounded like real shame rather than rehearsed apology. I don't have a good defense for that, Caleb. I just kept telling myself the friendship between you and me was real, separate from what happened, and that believing that let me live with it. I didn't know, even after that call, whether I would ever speak to him again. I knew, with more certainty, that the easy dinners, the holiday gatherings, the decade of casual brotherhood I'd extended to him without question, were permanently altered, regardless of what happened with Sophie. On the 6th day, I went home. Sophie was in the garden when I arrived, kneeling in the dirt, and she stood up too quickly when she saw my car, wiping her hands on her jeans with a nervousness that looked almost like the woman I'd first met 14 years earlier, before any of this, before the version of her I'd later learn had been carrying a secret since before our engagement. I'm not going to pretend I know what happens next, I said, standing at the edge of the garden, neither of us moving closer. I don't know if I can stay married to someone whose entire foundation with me included 6 years of silence about something this significant. I also don't know if 7 years of an otherwise real relationship gets erased by one decision made before we were even engaged. I understand if you need time, Sophie said. I understand if you need more than time. I do need time, I said. I don't know what it's going to tell me yet. I moved back into the house, but into the guest room, the way men in stories like this one always seem to end up doing. As if there's a script none of us realize we're following until we're already inside it. We talked, over the following weeks, more honestly than we had in years. Not just about Theo, but about the years that preceded him, the early uncertainty Sophie had never voiced, the assumptions I'd made about the permanence of our trust that had never actually been tested until now. I learned things about Sophie's fear of commitment that I'd never known, despite 7 years together. A fear rooted, she eventually admitted, in her parents' own complicated marriage, a fear that had made her question, in the months before our engagement, whether she was capable of the kind of permanent devotion I'd always assumed she felt as easily and naturally as I did. I learned that the affair with Theo, whatever else it was, had functioned for her as a kind of self-sabotage, a test she'd unconsciously run to see if she could destroy what we had before she let herself fully commit to it. And that when the test didn't destroy us, when I proposed anyway, unaware. She had buried the entire episode so deeply that maintaining the silence eventually felt like the only way to preserve the marriage she'd ultimately chosen. None of that made the 6 years of silence easier to accept. But it gave me, for the first time, something more complete than the bare fact of betrayal. A fuller picture of a woman I'd spent years assuming I understood completely, who turned out to be more frightened, more complicated, and more capable of self-protective deception than I'd ever imagined. I haven't decided, as I tell this story, whether I'm staying. Some mornings I wake up and feel something like the old trust trying to reassert itself, some old muscle memory of love that doesn't care what I've learned. Other mornings I look at Sophie across the kitchen table and see only the 6 years of toasts, the easy lie repeated at every anniversary, the brotherhood I extended to a man who had already crossed a line I never knew existed. What I know is this. I am no longer the man who assumes trust, once established, requires no further inspection. I check now. I ask the second question. I no longer mistake the absence of visible cracks for the presence of a solid foundation. Whether that lesson arrived in time to save this particular structure, I genuinely don't know yet. Some decisions, I'm learning, take longer to make than the moment that forces them. What makes this story difficult to categorize cleanly is that the betrayal didn't happen inside the marriage at all. It happened before it, in a window of uncertainty that both Sophie and Theo later buried under years of performed normalcy. The real wound, the one that ultimately mattered more than the act itself, was the 6 years of silence that followed, the toasts and holiday dinners conducted on top of a secret that excluded Caleb from a piece of his own history with 2 people he trusted completely. There's a particular cruelty in discovering that the trust you extended for years wasn't being violated by an active, ongoing deception, but by something already resolved and tucked away long before you noticed anything wrong. A one-time event reframed, through years of silence, into something closer to an ongoing structural flaw. Sophie didn't continue an affair behind Caleb's back for 6 years. She lived inside a marriage built on top of an undisclosed fracture, maintaining a friendship she'd never fully resolved her own feelings about, because resolving it honestly would have required a level of vulnerability she wasn't capable of offering at the time. Caleb's excessive, unexamined trust, his belief that loyalty, once proven, never needed reassessment, made him a man uniquely unequipped to notice what was hiding in plain sight for years. It wasn't naivety in the conventional sense. It was a specific kind of faith, the architectural faith of someone who builds things meant to last and assumes relationships work the same way, solid until proven otherwise, requiring no ongoing inspection. That faith, admirable in some contexts, became the very mechanism that allowed a 6-year secret to survive undisturbed in his own home. What this story ultimately illustrates is the gap between a single mistake and the much larger structure built to conceal it. If Sophie had told Caleb before the wedding, the story might have ended in a difficult but survivable conversation. Instead, the years of silence transformed a contained, resolvable error into something closer to a parallel life. A friendship maintained under false terms, a brotherhood extended to a man who had crossed a line neither of them ever acknowledged. The silence did more lasting damage than the original act, a pattern worth noticing in any relationship where shame, rather than honesty, becomes the primary strategy for managing a mistake. What stays with me about this one is the toast. The same easy line, repeated for years, that Caleb never once thought to question until a single text changed what it meant. Maybe that's the real lesson here. The people closest to us can hide an entire hidden history inside a sentence we've heard so many times we stop actually listening to it. If something in your life sounds rehearsed, sounds a little too smooth, too automatic, it might be worth asking what it's smoothing over. Not every secret needs to end a relationship, but every silence has a cost, and the people carrying it usually know that cost better than anyone, long before the rest of us catch up.